Ever wanted to go by The Fiend and have your skull displayed in a local newspaper? Well, today we're going to go over Stephen D. Richards, and he just did just that.
We here at Angry Me Production want to thank our sponsor, Mobile Notary Mindy. She's certified with the National Notary Association. She's also bonded and E&O insured. She offers a wide range of services including wills, powers of attorney, medical documents, healthcare proxies, living wills, certification of trust, assignment of personal property, HIPAA waivers, advanced healthcare directives, and 99 verification. You can find her on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at Mobile Notary Mindy. You can also visit her webpage at TexasMobileNotaryMindy.com. That's TX, MobileNotaryMindy.com. Thank you so much and enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen of all ages, boys and girls, thank you for tuning in to yet another episode of Angry Me Production. We appreciate you coming in and letting us be a part of your lives week in and week out. We hope to do our best to present you with something that your eardrums delight in. Whether you're looking at us on YouTube or Rumble, or listening to us on Spotify, Google, or Anchor, or any of the other podcast services that we are currently on or trying to get on, we thank you. And if you don't mind, at the end of every episode, stop by, leave us a comment, leave us a like. If it asks for 5 stars, we'll take 5 stars, even if you don't like us. 5 stars are what it's all about. With that being said, we hope you enjoy our attempt to make our advocation our vocation. Ladies and gentlemen, let the games begin.
Welcome, Angry Faithful. Yes, today we're going to go over Stephen D. Richards. It was kind of it's a timepiece on this one, and it's kind of weird. But anyways, let us begin. In the mid-19th century, Nebraska experienced a period of territorial expansion in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which this act was a territorial organic act that created the territories Kansas and Nebraska, and it was drafted by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas, passed by the 33rd United States Congress, and signed by law by President Franklin Price, and which saw the construction of Transcontinental Railroad also. In 1867, Nebraska was admitted into the Union as the 37th state, 2 years after the conclusion of the American Civil War. Nebraska's newfound statehood led to an influx of settlers among the growing population and publical conversaries. I probably messed that up, and there's a guy that keeps on commenting. Comment again. I messed up. Oh, well. Indicated by state first governor David Butler, renewed calls for a state constitution, which was made in 1871. At the time, Richard's crime spree and trial, Nebraska's law and justice system had only recently begun to be developed, with the state criminal code written into a state law in 1871. Before his execution, the state only had one recorded execution in 1863, 4 years before the inclusion into the United States. Now, Stephen D. Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia, on March 18th, 1856. He was said to have 5 sisters and a brother. When Richards was 6, the family relocated to Ohio. God, and you can comment as much as you want on that one, because I'm going to mess these things up. First in Monroe County and then to Noble County. The family later settled in Quaker Village in Mount Pleasant in Ohio when he was 11. Richards later described his mother as a devout Methodist and his father a farmer. As having no profession of religion, Richards attended school in Mount Pleasant. He claimed that the teachers considered him well behaved. At his mother's insistence, he also attended Sunday school and church regularly. Upon the age of 12, Richard lived with his parents, working for farmers and other locals in the area. On September 16th, 1861, Richard's mother died of unknown causes. At the age of 20, Richards met and became engaged to a young woman named Anna Milhorn, with whom he regularly corresponded during his later travels. Upon his final arrest, Richards also met men whom he described as being questionable occupation. He began passing counterfeit bills he obtained from a man in New York City. In February 1876, he left Mount Pleasant, heading west for better career opportunities. For a short time, Richards lived in Iowa, working as a farm hand in Burlington and Morning Sun. He was later hired as an attendant at the Ohio Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Okay. Tasked with burying deceased patients. The New York Times wrote that Richard's times working at the asylum was a significant event in his life that shaped his humanity and view of human race. When he denied witnessing an abuse of an asylum patient, he would later reflect that during his tenure of disposing of deceased patients, he became accustomed to viewing people as nothing more than meat. Wow, that's okay. Richards left the asylum in 1876 of October, beginning drifting from Midwestern United States, finding intermittent work and occasionally consorting with train robbers. He stayed in Kansas City briefly before moving on to Nebraska, where he passed through Hastings before arriving at Kearney. Residents there for 3 to 4 weeks before leaving Cheyenne County. According to Richards, he became involved in several gunfights during his stay, resulting in him shooting each individual. Although he stated he was unaware of their condition after the confrontation. During this period, Richards went under the name William Hudson, later discarding this once he reached Kansas City. Now, his earlier murders and the confession written after his final arrest, Richards admitted to having killed 4 men during his travels around Nebraska and Iowa. Between 1876 and 1877, he described committing his first murder sometimes in the late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney. According to Richards, he met a man while traveling on horseback through the Nebraskan countryside, and a pair decided to camp there for the night near Derby town. Several newspapers reported that the 2 men's campsite was near the Sand Hills. Settling down for the night, the 2 began gambling in the card game, and Richards winning most of the stranger's money. As the 2 set off to Kearney and following morning, the other man turned on Richards and demanded his money back. Richards refused, and whereupon he claimed the other man became belligerent. Richards then shot him over the left eye, killing him instantly. After confirming the man was dead, he disposed of the body in the Plaintiff River. Several days later, as he continued his trek to Kearney, Richards began to encounter another man 15 miles from an area called Walker's Ranch. The man had seen Richards and previously traveled together, and the stranger asked that he become of that man. Oh, the other person that was riding with him. While talking to him, Richards realized that this man and the deceased were friends and business partners. Richards denied any knowledge of the dead man, but his friend continued to hound Richards with questions, which caused Richards to become increasingly anxious. Believing the man knew too much, Richards decided to kill the stranger to prevent any discovery of the murder. When the stranger turned his back to Richards, he was shot in the back of the head, and he disposed of the corpse and sold the man's horse in the nearby town. Before reaching Kearney, Richard stopped at the home of Jasper Harrelson, who, according to Richards, was a train robber. Mary Jasper's wife, noticed upon his arrival that Richard's shirt was stained with blood and commented on it. Richards had not noticed the blood on his clothing and claimed to reply, as if in jest, that it must have come from the man he had murdered. That ended the conversation. After his stay, Richard transferred to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit money to purchase a horse and buggy from an unidentified man. After he left, the seller discovered the bills were not genuine. Tracking Richards down, the seller demanded Richard give him real money or return the horse and buggy. When Richards refused both demands, the man threatened him with him being arrested. Richards responded by shooting him and then buried the body in the near left area. In March 1877, Richard and a young man with the surname Grimley left Grand Island. Is that Grimley? Gimley? Let's Stephanie Hawking this real quick.
Gems.
Anyways, they left Grand Island, Nebraska on a horseback and headed towards Kearney. As they neared their destination, they stopped and camped for the night between Lowell and Kearney along the Platte River. Richards woke up at about 3 a.m. and roused his partner, telling him it was near morning and they should get back on the road. Gremling, infiltrated at being woken up so early, began to argue with Richards. The argument continued, and Richards later recounted. It was a good thing you didn't mean all you said, I said. But I do mean it, he said. You don't want to mean it, I said. And he picked up his revolver and said, here is something that backs all that I said. Cocked it, looked at him, and thought, the fool act if he means to shoot. And skipping out my 33, I plugged him in the head. That was the first trouble we had ever had. After leaving the area, Richards arrived at Kearney, registered under the name F.A. Hudge at the local hotel. During his stay, Richards united with several other accomplices, George Dutch Henry Johnson and his companion Hearst, as well as a man who went by the name Mr. Burns. On March 21st, Richards was arrested alongside with Burns, whom he had been spent most of his time with. At the time, both men were told as the reason of their arrest, although Richards came to suspect that it was for the murder of Grimley. Anyways, it was only later that they were notified by the authorities that they were under suspicion for murder of a man named Peter Getaway, whom Richard claimed his innocence over. Although Richard was soon acquitted, Burns was held in custody because of the testimony of the sporting lady. What is a sporting lady? Sporting lady? Oh, prostitute. Okay. This is the second time they've come up with new words, because the first one that I heard for someone that does, sexual acts for money was the two gangster brothers, and it was Rent Boys. Now it's Sporting Lady. That's the new one. Who he previously acquaintance with. Burns was also being acquitted sometime later, for no evidence was found linking him to the crime. Now, in June 1878, while in Kearney, Richards was arrested and jailed for larceny. He would later claim that these charges were unfounded. During his time in jail, he reunited with Mary L. Harrelson. Shortly after Richards arrived, he had been arrested upon suspicion of having aided the escape of her husband and another prisoner named Underwood and Nixon from the Kearney jail. Richardson and Mary Harrelson agreed that she would sell him the deed to her property 6 months later for $600, a total of $17,000 in 2024. After Richards released from jail, he traveled around Nebraska for several months. He did business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island before arriving at the Harrison's Kearney's countryside on October 18th, 1878. Mary Harrison transferred the property to Richard upon his arrival, and he's stayed there for several weeks. The New York Daily Herald later responded that Richard had married Harrison on November 2nd, and what the newspaper alleged was a scam to acquire ownership of the Harris land. A month later, Richard decided to kill Harrison and her 3 children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, nicknamed Jesse. In his confession, Richard claimed that Harrison had discovered that he was guilty of murder, and he feared that she might betray his presence to the authorities. In silence, Harrison ensured that his previous crime remained hidden. Richard resolved to murder the entire family. It's messed up. I don't know what it is with men's minds when it's like get and yes, this is the only reason why I say this is because I've only seen like men do this. Is they get freaked out, so they just wipe out the whole entire family. And you're probably asking yourself, what do you mean freaked out? Or they get freaked out of being discovered on something. The first one I've noticed this was the one where guy cheated on his wife and he wiped out his whole entire family so he could be with the other woman. And this is like 2018. But anyways, I digress. On November 3rd, 1878, Richard got up early in the morning along with another man named Brown. He had been staying at the house. Brown left to feed the horses and complete other chores around the farm. Richards found a spade and dug a hole, then sneaked back into the house and murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jesse with an axe. According to one report, Mary and one of the children were murdered with a smoothing iron. What is this? Oh, smoothing iron is a clothing iron. If you didn't know that, now you do. Smoothing iron. That's another name for an iron. I love old-timey words. While the other 2 was physically assaulted. These claims were reported in some modern-day sources who graphically describe Richard's killing Jasper by bashing his head against the wall. However, these alternate details of the murder were refuted by Richards himself, saying he had killed the family while they were asleep. He said that most of them had died after the first several bullets, with except Daisy, who had writhed in pain for some time, by Richard's own accounts. Richard was said to be have scrubbed the blood off the floor himself after the murders, before claiming sitting down for breakfast. After he had eaten, he carried the bodies out of the house and buried them in the hole he dug nearby. When later questioned about the Harrelsons' disappearance, Richards told several people the family had left with Brown, and he did not know when they were returned. What happened to Brown? He left the. Okay, hold on. Let's get through this rest of the story. A 21st century account stated Richards had made claims of transferring the deed to the farm to him, and subsequently left him with her children to reunite with her husband. The bodies of Harrison and her children were discovered in December 11th. Some reports they had been concealed underneath a haystack rather than buried, as Richard had later claimed. Now on December 9th, 1878, Richards agreed. What happened to Brown? That I'm reading this and I'm trying to figure out what happened to Brown. We'll hopefully it pans out beforehand. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's get. On December 9th, 1878, Richards agreed to help his neighbor, 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, who had worked on Anderson's property. The Columbus Journal reported that Richards had used the alias Dick Richardson when working for Anderson. On December 9th, Anderson became ill after eating a meal Richards had prepared, causing him to suspect Richards had poisoned him. Anderson informed a neighbor of this suspicion. The next day, he confronted Richards, and the two fought. Richards either beat Anderson to death with a hammer or a hatchet, or shot him. Conspiracy newspaper accounts vary. Contemporary newspapers accounts vary. Dyslexia, gotta love it. Anyways, Anderson's body later discovered in the ceiling of his house, buried underneath a pile of coal. Richards strongly denied poisoning Anderson, saying that was not his style. It's pretty bad that you go up and you're like, okay, I might have murdered him, but I didn't poison him because, I really like the exercise of bashing somebody in the head with a hatchet. Anyways, he claimed Anderson had attacked him with a knife, and he killed Anderson in self-defense. Anderson was later buried in Bethany Cemetery in Axtell, Nebraska. Shortly after that, Richard fled Courtney shortly after Anderson's murder, especially expecting that the bodies would soon be discovered. And the evening, as he hitched up Anderson's horse and prepared to leave, some of Anderson's neighbors arrived. They had noticed Anderson's absence, questioned Richard about it. He reportedly told the Andersons Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbor entered the dwelling, Richards fled on horseback, riding to Bloomington. He traveled east by horse and train and on foot, passing through Omaha and Chicago. While on the run, he met up with Jasper Harrelson and Harrison's fellow escaped prisoner. The three traveled through Wheeling, West Virginia, into Ohio, passing through Bridgeport before arriving in Richards' hometown of Mount Pleasant. Nebraska Governor Silsa Gabber issued an arrest warrant for Richards on December 16th, 1878, and promised a reward of $200, equivalent to $6,000 in 2024, for his arrest conviction. Most accounts state, though, on December 20th, after Richard arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance accompanied by two unidentified women. Copies of a wanted purchase featuring Richard have been circulating throughout the town recently. Man, for that time frame, that was fast. That was really fast because they issued the warrant on December 16th, and 4 days later, it reached Mount Pleasant. That is fast for that time frame. Honestly, that is seriously fast. Copies of a wanted poster featured Richards and been circulating throughout the town recently, and a constable named McGrew. Let's see, Stephanie Hawking, please give me a hand.
McGrew.
Yeah, McGrew. Recognized him from the poster. He enlisted the help of the petitionary guards named Floggy. The two men armed themselves with shotguns to set off Richards. They found him walking through a field just outside the town with two women. He was unarmed and quickly surrendered. Richards claimed that he had spotted the officers approaching him and intended to fight his way out of the situation. He told the women to head back to town. They refused, however, so Richard chose to surrender. He said if the women had left, he would have been avoided the arrest. And by the statement of Richards, he said, if I hadn't had the two girls with me, I guess the Constable McGrew who arrested me would have been a dead man. Either one of us would, or I'd have shot. Of course, it claims that he didn't have a weapon. Richards said that if he had escaped, he would have gone to Nebraska as a reason that it was the last place that anybody would look. Why go back to the place that they have a warrant for you? But by all means, some accounts differed from the date of place of the arrest. The Wheeling Daily Intelligencer. This is a weird one. Intelligencer. Anyways, the Wheeling Daily said that upon arriving to the town near Mount Pleasant, Richards was identified by a former acquaintance who had detained him with the help of another person. One source claims that Richards was arrested in 1879 in Austin, Texas. Wow, that's weird. 78. Then a year later, he was arrested. That's weird. One modern account reported that Richards, whom they listed under the same Samuel Richards, had been identified and captured in Pinkerton by Pinkerton agents. We all know that from Red Dead Redemption 2. There were even conflicts describing of Richardson's appearance. These have described him as an approximately 6 feet 2 inches and heavily built and dark hair and blue eyes. However, the accounts of Dr. Moreland, who performed the psychological what the hell is it? Craniology. Basically, it's the one where you put like the things on the top of a person and you can figure out what kind of thing they have, if they're intelligent or stupid, or craniology, basically. Examination of riches before they used to do that a lot back in the 1900s. And it's still a thing, but nobody believes in it. But examining Richards before the execution conflicted these descriptions of him. In his examination report, Moreland said Richards had light brown hair and dark gray eyes. At his execution, one spectator later described Richardson having still gray eyes that were almost bluish in color and brown hair. The Working Man's Friend in Leavenworth, Kansas newspaper reported that Chicago authorities agreed part of the reward after his arrest. That's just all kinds of strange, but it's part of the notes. After his arrest, Richards was jailed in Cernville, Ohio. While there, he wrote 2 articles for a local newspaper, confessing to 9 murders in 3 years. Sheriff David Samerson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Martin in Kearney County, both of whom had been persuaded of Richards to Ohio, returning him to Nebraska. Due to the public outrage, Anderson and Martin feared that Richards would be lynched if he had returned to any of the locations where he had committed his crime. So it was decided to avoid taking him to either of these places initially. At the time of Richards' arrest, authorities expected he was a member of a gang of outlaws who had plagued the state, and even the group leader. He was even the group leader. Law enforcement was able to definitely link Richards into 9 murders to which he had confessed, suggesting that he might have killed even more. Something that the Nebraska State Journal expressed and doubted on. Shortly after, before his trial, Richards predicted that he would be convicted and hanged for his crimes. Well, no, yeah, I can understand. He was moved to a jail in Omaha on December 28th, then transferred to Kearney by train. On December 30th, a crowd of enraged townfolk gathered outside the jail in Kearney, where Richards was being kept. Fearing a lynching, authorities took extra precautions to ensure Richards' safety, as well as their own. While being moved to a depot, Richards was said to have been impressed by the large crowd, asking whether the whole town was there to see him. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, and there was no further incidents during the rest of his stay in Kearney. The trial began on January 16th, 1879, in Minden, Nebraska, with Judge William Gasson presiding. The prosecution was led by a district attorney named Schofield, and Richard's defense was led by a lawyer named Savage. That's a good name for a lawyer for your defense. What is your lawyer's name? Savage. Schofield laid out the indictment of murder in the first degree for the killings of Harrelson and family members and Anderson. Richard pled not guilty, arguing that Anderson's killing was in self-defense and therefore justifiable. The prosecution called 7 witnesses to the stand. They all testified to the state that Anderson was found Richard was called to testify. When questioned by Schofield, he admitted to killing Anderson with a hammer after a heated argument, but reiterated that he had done so in self-defense. Richard said that although repeatedly warning not to do so, Anderson had reached for a nearby hatchet. The prosecution then entered into evidence the hammer that he had used to kill Anderson. Richards identified it as the murder weapon. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richards guilt of murder of the Harrelson and Anderson. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution date was April 26, 1879. Richard was described as being cheerful and indifferent to both the proceedings and his conviction. Wow. Okay, this newspaper is okay. I'm gonna let Stephanie Hawking say this because the last part is funny.
Sedalia Weekly Bazoo.
Sedalia Weekly Bazoo. I wonder if that newspaper is still around. Hold on. We'll find out real quick. See if that one is still around. Okay, it stopped being around in 1904, so it's no longer around. But that would have been funny if it's still around. I wish it was still around. Shortly after his conviction, Richards managed to smuggle a knife into his cell and using it to kill himself. But the weapon was discovered by the authorities and confiscated before he could do so. No other newspaper recorder corroborates the story, however. His execution, when Richards was returned to Nebraska, the Omaha Herald wrote that he manifest supreme indifference to his lot, was perfectly willing to be brought directly to Kearney jurisdiction, and said he had also soon die one way as another. After Richard's conviction, Sheriff Martin announced that his execution in Maiden would be open to the public, even though Martin feared the audience of a large number of spectators could become violent. To prevent a riot, an enclosure was constructed around the gallows to separate the expected crowd from Richards. However, tickets that allowed the audience into the restricted. God, I love the 1900s sometimes. Basically, they sold tickets to get a little bit closer to the execution. And people bought the tickets. Richards was allowed to invite people. He had chosen members of the press whom he had befriended while in prison. One such ticket of eminence was recently discovered and is now in the collection of Nebraska Historical Society. Someone found the ticket of admittance. Someone found one of the tickets, and now it's in a historical society. Oh God, I love the 1900s. They did some really weird stuff. The spectators at the execution were said to have numbers between 2,000 to 2,500. No, 2,000 to 25,000. I'm sorry. Just the ticket sales was hilarious. As the crowd become increasingly aggregated, the authorities pleaded with them to stay outside the enclosure, but guards were unable to prevent the spectators from destroying the barrier. When they sold tickets to it, and people broke through the barrier, so the tickets. Oh, I'd be pissed if I bought tickets. I was like, "What are you letting those people? Those are poor people. They're cutting in my area." But anyways, I digress. But guards weren't able to prevent the spectators from destroying the barrier. One witness in the incident, a man named Rolf Johnson, later wrote that 20 to 30 people in the crowd cut the rope. It was just a rope. Okay. 30 people cut the rope as the authorities tried to stop the crowd. The mobs proceeded to pull the post out of the ground and attempting to drag the makeshift barrier away while guards were pulling the rope. at the other end, and what Johnson described a tug of war. The mob succeeded in pulling the rope away from guards and then proceeded to destroy the barrier completely. At 1 p.m., Richards was led to the gallows by Martin and his deputies. This pacified the crowd. Upon acceding to the gallows, Richards launched into an impassive defense of his actions. He again claimed that the killings of Anderson was still self-defense and disavowed any involvement with the murders of Harrelson family. He claimed that he was not the victim of a wrongful conviction. He was said that he has found the Lord and made his peace with God and his faith in Christ. Asked the crowd to join him in singing hymn, "Come Thou Found of Every Blessing," in which spectators documented the events of the execution in his journal. Observed that Richards appeared calm and collected during his entire ordeal. Richards' final words were said to be, "Jesus be with me now." Reverend W. Stanford Gee, who presented over the execution, later told the reporters he'd hoped Richard's profession of religious salvation were genuine, but allowed that they might not have been. At 1:17 p.m. on August 26, 1876, Richards was hanged. The St. Louis Global Democrat said it took 15 minutes for him to die. Jeez! They must have did that rope a little long. Richard, because once you release the trap door, if they use the trap door and you drop, your neck is supposed to just snap. If anything, if your neck doesn't snap instantaneously because the rope is too long, you suffocate. So, just a little tidbit. Richard was the first person in Nebraska's history to be executed since its incorporation into the United States in 1867. Shortly after his execution, a photographer was able to capture a photography of Richard's corpse propped inside of a coffin. The aftermath, local doctors hounded Richards before his execution, requesting him to donate his body for medical purposes. He refused and was buried in Meldon. Despite his gravesite being guarded, his corpse was stolen the night after his execution. The Sandola Weekly Bazoo suspected the doctor had wanted to examine him, but was returned to his resting place shortly thereafter. Sometime later, his body was dug up once again. This time, Richard's bones were scattered on the street of Corning on November 1st, 1882. Jeez. They were playing hide and seek with his bones. But anyways, it was reported that Curtin County Gazette had obtained Richard's skulls and placed it on display in the newspaper's office window. This is the last reported mention of Richard's skull, and the present location status is unknown. After his arrest, many people describe Richards as charismatic, claiming that he successfully concealed his dark nature under a polite, authentic, and handsome exterior. A friend who accompanied Richard's autobiography to his interviews said that during one of his visits, Richards did not even have the look of a murderer. Contemporary observers remarked that Richards seemed to feel no guilt whatsoever about his crimes. Numerous times between his arrest and execution, Richards was asked why he had no empathy towards his victims and remorse for his crimes. Sometimes he simply refused to answer. When he did choose to reply to this question, he gave conflicting responses. He usually cited his association with people of questionable morals, and his times working with Mount Pleasant Asylum had deleterious influences. That's a weird word. Delirious. It literally is. I'm confused and baffled about the words back then.
Deleterious influences.
Deleterious influence. That's still a weird word. Anyways, When the Nebraska State Journal questioned him about the lack of remorse for his heinous crimes he was committed, particularly those of the Harris family, Richard recount on the event from his childhood. He had been tasked to kill a litter of kittens, and he did so by bashing each one of their heads against a tree. After he had killed those kittens, makes sense, you know. Mutilation of animals, one of the things that serial killers do. He found he felt no guilt about it and found that killing was fun. Although some outlets, including modern day author Michael Newton, who Michael Newton is, the Executioner book series. Cool. Classified Richards as a thrill killer. In an interview with the press, Richards admitted denying that he had any enjoyment inflicting pain. He enjoyed inflicting pain upon others, claiming that his younger years, other people had considered him to be kind. Reporters who interviewed him after his arrest were often struck by his calm, collective behavior. An article in the New York Daily Herald described him as being carefree and cheerful. In an interview with Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, Stephanie, just, Yuri.
Intelligencer.
Intelligencer. Man, that messes up your dyslexia really bad if you have dyslexia. Richard said he knew he was executed for his crimes, but that was unafraid of death, and he's ready to meet it. When the jury sentenced him to death, he said he had been unconcerned and in good spirits. Now, there's a little tidbit on this. At the time of Richard's arrest and execution, it was a popular belief that all criminals were of poor quality and limited education. The horrifying nature of his crimes gave Richards the notoriety, which increased after his capture due to the part his not fitting the public precondition of criminals. With reporters and members of the public often struck by his charisma, good looks, and his education, often outspokenness. Richards featured in a handful of books and periodicals. The first of these was The Philosophy of the Insane, Richard, the Nebraska Fiend, by Dr. John Sanderson Christensen, published in February 9th, 1879. Now, there's several articles and everything on this, but it is kind of scaring. Oh, yeah. In the 2018 video game Red Dead Redemption 2 featured a character, Edmund Laurie Jr., who was portrayed based on Richardson. Richards was featured in the 2021 novel Scarlet Pen, written by Jennifer Orkelin, as a part of a historical crime series, True Colors. Now, this is kind of like this guy's kind of sounding like Ted Bundy, if you think about it. And by the way, if you want, there is a historical marker, Town, that recounts all this in Kearney County, Nebraska. So if you want to look at that, or if you do a vacation and whatnot. Anyways, everybody, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. Comment if you want. Most of the comments have been bad. It's like I'm retarded, or I'm unintelligent. I can't read, which I have severe dyslexia. That's the only excuse I have, and I go over this stuff like constantly. So it's just me being dyslexic. So, but I'm more than welcome to any of the comments and everything. Yeah, it helps the channel and it helps me out, I guess, for getting this channel out. But thank you all for watching and listening on this episode. Thank you all.